American Politics Today, Chapter 9 by Bianco and Canon, Chapter 9, Part 2. Interest Group Strategies. Once a group has organized and determined its goals, the next step is to decide how to lobby. There are two types of possible tactics: inside strategies, which are actions taken inside government, whether federal, state, or local, and outside strategies, which are actions taken outside government. See how it works lobbying the federal government. The type of strategy is sometimes dictated by the policy in question. In the example of tax breaks for wealthy individuals and companies, hidden in the CARES Act, discussed in the chapter opener, an insider strategy was essential because the public would have been opposed had it known about these tax breaks. In other cases, such as the AARP's lobbying effort to help save the Affordable Care Act, an outside strategy is effective to help put pressure on members of Congress. Sorry about that. Inside strategies involve contact with elected officials or bureaucrats. Thus, inside strategies require a group to establish an office in Washington or hire a lobbying firm to act on its behalf. Direct lobbying: when interest group staff meet with office holders or bureaucrats, they plead their case through the direct lobbying, asking government officials to change policy in line with the group's goals. Direct lobbying is generally aimed at officials and, let me pause this for you in case you wish to read this. Direct lobbying is generally aimed at officials and bureaucrats who are sympathetic to the group's goals. Through these efforts, interest groups and their representatives help like-minded legislators secure policy changes that they both want. Groups can assist in a number of ways, from sharing information about proposed changes to providing lists of legislators who might be persuaded about the proposed changes, to providing lists of legislators who might be persuaded in support the group's goals, to drafting legislative proposals or regulations. Interest groups also contact fence sitters who neither support or oppose them, with the goal of converting them to supporters. These efforts are less extensive than the lobbying of supporters because opponents are unlikely to change their minds unless a group can provide new information that causes them to rethink their position. As these descriptions indicate, interest groups place a high priority on maintaining access to their lobbying targets and being able to present their arguments regardless of whether they expect to get what they want. Of course, interest groups want to achieve their policy goals, but access is the first step that makes persuasion possible. Therefore, many interest groups try to keep up their efforts low-key, providing information to friends and opponents alike, and avoiding threats or harsh words in the hope that they will leave a favorable impression and be able to gain access the next time they want to lobby their opponents. After all, people who oppose a group's current priorities one day may agree with the group on some future issue. In their efforts at direct lobbying, interest groups contact elected officials, members of other president's staff, and bureaucrats in the executive branch. They seek this wide range of contacts because different officials play distinct roles in the policy-making process and thus have various types of influence. Members of Congress shape legislation and budgets. Members of the President's staff influence the formation of new policies and obtain presidential consent for new laws, and executive branch bureaucrats change the ways new regulations are written and policies are implemented. Drafting legislation and regulations. Interest groups sometimes draft legislative proposals and regulations, which they deliver to legislators and bureaucrats as part of their lobbying efforts. In recent years, the role of lobbyists in drafting legislation has become more prominent because Congress has less internal capacity to write the laws due to cuts in committee staff. Interest groups do not give proposals to just anyone. They seek out legislators who already support their cause, who have significant influence within Congress. For example, a lobbying effort aimed at cutting interest rates on student loans would target supporters of this change who are also members of the Congressional Committee with jurisdiction over student loan programs, preferably someone who chairs the committee or one of its subcommittees. Interest groups also lobby bureaucrats to influence the details of new regulations. If the types of regulations involved can go in effect without congressional approval, then lobbying the bureaucracy can result in groups getting exactly what they want. If new regulations require approval by Congress or White House staff, then interest groups can increase their chances of success by getting involved in the initial drafting of policy. Research. Interest groups often prepare research reports on topics of interest to the group. For example, Public Citizen features on its website a series of research reports on topics such as protecting democracy, making government work, consumer and worker safety, globalization and trade, climate and energy, healthcare and justice, and the courts. Such reports may sway public opinion or help persuade elected officials or bureaucrats. They also help interest group staff claim expertise on some aspect of public policy. Members of Congress are more likely to accept a group legislative proposal if they think that the group staff has solid research to back up its claims. Journalists are also likely to respond to an interest group's request for publicity if they think that group staff has supporting evidence. Hearings. Interest group staff often testify before congressional committees. In part, this activity seeks to inform members of Congress about issues that matter to the group. For example, the NRA's website shows that its staff has testified in state legislatures and in the U.S. Congress in favor of right to carry laws, as well as laws that would grant immunity to gun manufacturers for harm committed with weapons they produced, and against universal background checks and federal funding for research on gun violence. Litigation. Another inside strategy involves taking the government to court. In bringing their case, interest groups can argue that the government's actions are not consistent with the Constitution, or that the government has misinterpreted existing law. Interest groups can also become involved in an existing case by filing amicus curiae, friend of the court, briefs. These are documents that offer the groups rationale for how the judges should decide the case. The drawback of litigation is that it is costly and time-consuming. Cases can take years to work through federal court systems. In fact, most groups that use the litigation strategy combine it with direct lobbying or other strategies. Working together. To increase their chances for success, interest groups can work together in their lobbying efforts, formulating a common strategy and future plans. Legislators are more likely to respond, or at least provide access, when many groups with large or diverse memberships are all asking for the same thing. In general, these collaborations are short-term efforts focused on achieving a specific outcome, like supporting or opposing the confirmation of judicial and cabinet nominees. The tax giveaway discussed in the chapter opener had unlikely allies such as Coca-Cola, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Morgan Stanley, and the National Association of Manufacturers, whose members include companies such as ExxonMobil, Raytheon, and Caterpillar, which would all gain billions of dollars from the change in the tax law. The problems with working together is that groups may agree on general goals but disagree on specifics. If differences cannot be bridged, groups may undertake separate and possibly conflicting lobbying efforts, or decide against lobbying entirely. For example, although there are many groups pressing for climate change legislation, they have not developed a unified lobbying effort. The problem? The groups disagree on which policies should be implemented, who should pay for them, and whether the government should aid companies that would be forced to purchase new anti-pollution equipment. Here again, we see how conflict and compromise infuse another aspect of the American political process. I will pause for this so that you may look at this. And here is how it works. Outside strategies. Outside strategies involve actions that interest groups undertake across the country rather than in Washington. Again, these activities can be orchestrated by the group or can be organized by a firm that the group hires. Grassroots lobbying. Directly involving interest group members in lobbying efforts is called grassroots lobbying. Members may send letters, make telephone calls, participate in protest, or express their demand in other ways. Mass protest, another form of grassroots lobbying, seek to capture the attention of government officials and also draw media coverage, with the idea of publicizing the group's goals and perhaps gaining new members or financial support. Grassroots strategies are useful because elected officials do not like to act against a large group of citizens who care enough about an issue to express their position. Officials may not agree with the group's goals, but they will likely arrange a meeting with its staff so they appear willing to learn about their constituents' demands. However, these member-based strategies work only for interest groups with a large number of members because legislators pay attention to a letter-writing campaign only when they receive several thousand pieces of mail. In addition, the letters or other efforts have to come from Congress members' own constituents. The effectiveness of grassroots lobbying also depends on perceptions of how much a group has done to motivate participation. Suppose a representative gets 10,000 emails demanding an increase in federal student aid, but virtually all the messages contain the same appeal because they were generated and sent from a group's website. Congressional staff refer to these efforts as the AstroTurf lobbying. Given the letter's similarity, the representative may discount the effort, believing that it says more about the group's ability to make campaign participation accessible than it does about the number of district residents who strongly support an increase in federal student aid. Even so, politicians are sometimes reluctant to completely dismiss AstroTurf efforts. The fact that so many people participated, even with the facilitation by an interest group, means that their demands should at least be considered. Mobilizing public opinion. One strategy related to grassroots lobbying involves trying to change what the public thinks about an issue in the hope that elected official will notice this change and respond by enacting or opposing new laws or regulations in order to keep their constituents happy. Virtually all interest groups try to influence opinion. Most maintain a website that presents their message and write press releases to get media coverage. Most groups are also very active on social media using Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and keep in touch with members and let them know about the issues that the group is working on. Any contact with citizens, whether to encourage them to join the group, contribute money, or engage in grassroots lobbying, also involves elements of persuasion, trying to transform citizens into supporters and supporters into true believers, and even activists. In the case of gun control, for example, the NRA has an aggressive campaign to encourage members to contact their elected officials and to express their opinions. A focused mobilization effort involves contacting large numbers of potential supporters beyond just members through email, phone calls, direct mail, television, advertising, print media, social media, and websites in order to get legislators to respond. A group has to persuade large numbers of people to become involved. Electioneering. Interest groups get involved in elections by making contributions to candidates, urging people to help in a campaign, endorsing candidates, funding campaign ads, or mobilizing a candidate's or party's supporters. All these efforts seek to influence who gets elected, with the expectation that changing who gets elected will affect what the government does. Federal laws limits groups. Electioneering and lobbying efforts, see nuts and bolts 9.2. For example, most privately owned organizations and associations in America are organized as 501c3 organizations, a designation based on their IRS classification, which means that donations to the group are tax deductible. However, 501c3 organizations must not advocate for or against political candidates, and lobbying must constitute more than 20% of the group's total expenditures. Certain public education programs or voter registration drives that are conducted in a nonpartisan manner do not count toward that 20%. Although some groups are always looking for loopholes in these restrictions, groups that want to engage in lobbying or electioneering without looking for exceptions can incorporate under the IRS designations and operate as Political Action Committee, PAC, a 527 organization, or a 501c4 organization. Although contributions to these organizations are not tax deductible, such organizations have fewer restrictions on the size of the contributions or how their money is spent. For example, 527 organizations have no contribution or spending limits. Two new options for electioneering by interest groups emerged in recent elections: super PACs and 501c4 organizations. The former was a consequence of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that authorized unlimited independent spending by corporations and labor unions in federal elections. Many groups set up PACs to take advantage of the latest rules. The super label reflects the fact that these groups take in and spend more money than the typical PAC. All the major 2020 presidential candidates had an independent super PAC running ad campaigns on their behalf. In 2020, federally focused PACs and super PACs spent more than $7 billion for electioneering and contributions to candidates and parties, of which Act Blue raised a staggering $3.45 billion and Win Red raised $1.35 billion. However, these large numbers mask some important details. To begin with, of the largest firms in America, Google, Walmart, and ExxonMobil, for example, have PACs that spend only $1 million or so on contributions. Another large firm, Apple, has no PAC. The PAC for Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America is so small, and other influential interest groups earlier in Figure 9.2, the AARP, the NARAL, Pro-Choice America, and the Family Research Council spend even less or don't have a PAC or a 527. These numbers suggest that the money doesn't buy elections or policy outcomes. If it did, these organizations would probably spend a lot more on campaign donations and television ads. Spending totals can also be deceptive. The National Association of Realtors, for example, made about $3.5 million in contributions in 2020, but spread the funds out over 500 candidates, with slightly more going to Democrats than Republicans. The PAC for Emily's List collected over $72 million, but only $16.9 million went to contributions to candidates and parties, with the rest for fundraising and overhead. Another large spender, Next Gen Climate Action, was funded largely by a single wealthy donor, but did not make any contributions to federal candidates in the 2020 cycle. Their spending was on issue ads. The founder, billionaire, entrepreneur Tom Steyer ran as a candidate for president during the 2020 Democratic primary, and some groups used most of their money against candidates they opposed. The conservative super PAC, America First Action, spent almost all of its $134 million against Democratic contenders. Finally, while the $7 billion that these groups raised together seems large, only about 2/3 was spent on behalf of or as contributions to candidates. Most PACs contributed to only a few candidates, and while more than 1,000 super PACs were active in the 2020 election, most were small, and the average group spent just over $500,000. These data highlight a sharp difference in electioneering strategies between the very few large, well-funded interest groups and everyone else, a few 527s. Super PAC 501c4s and PACs have the money to deploy massive advertising and mobilization efforts for a candidate or issue they like or against those they don't like. There are also some very large associations that can persuade large numbers of members to work and vote for candidates that the group supports or against candidates that the group wants to defeat. And just for Very few rich individuals can make outsized contributions to a candidate they favor. But these strategies are not available to the vast majority of interest groups, which simply don't have the resources. They give modest help to a few candidates who are sympathetic to their goals in the hope that once elected, the office holder will remember their contribution when their group asks for a meeting. Some groups do no electioneering at all, possibly because they lack sufficient funds, because they want to avoid making enemies based on whom they do or do not support, or because their other strategies are more promising given the resources that are available to them. Many groups opt for quiet lobbying efforts that use their expertise or undertake grassroots efforts to build support of their policy goals. Massive electioneering operations by interest groups are relatively rare. Cultivating media contacts. Media coverage helps a group publicize its concerns without spending any money. Such attention may mobilize public opinion indirectly by getting people to join the group, contribute money, or demand that elected officials support the group's agenda. Favorable media coverage also helps group leaders assure members that they are actively working on members' concerns. This is Nuts and Bolts 9.2. I will try and get as close as I can, so that if you wish to pause. Journalists listen when interest groups call if they feel that a group's story will catch their readers' attention or address their concerns. Smart interest group leaders make it easy for journalists to cover their cause, holding events that produce intriguing news stories. These stories may not change anyone's minds, but the media coverage provides free publicity for the group's policy agendas. How much power do interest groups have? Two 2020 presidential candidates, Democrats Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, focused much of their campaigns on the need to reduce the power of large corporations and special interests over policy making in Washington. While neither Sanders nor Warren gained the nomination, their campaigns spoke for the widely held belief about how Washington works, that interest groups have too much power and something drastic must be done to end their domination over policy making in Washington. Donald Trump capitalized on the same issue, on the same sentiment, with his pledge to drain the swamp in 2016. As we discuss in the What Do We the Facts Say feature, some studies of interest group influence support Sanders and Warren's claims, but others tell a different story, one in which a group's chances of getting what it wants depend on whether there is organized opposition to its demand. In other words, as one analyst put it, the solution to lobbying is more lobbying. Here's what the facts say. Interest group power. I hope you can read that. What determines when interest groups succeed? 3 factors shape interest group influence. The first is the group's goals. Does it want to change policy, including enacting a new policy, or to prevent change? The second is the amount of public attention a group gets. How many Americans care about what a group is trying to do? The third is conflict. To what extent do other groups or other public oppose the policy change? Change versus preventing change. In general, groups are going to have an easier time preventing a change than working to implement one. As we discuss in Chapter 2, enacting a new policy requires the approval of both houses of Congress, the President's signature, or a veto override, and implementation from the appropriate bureaucratic agency. Each of these steps provides an opportunity for interest groups to lobby members of government to do nothing. So if the groups are successful, change will not occur. Studies show that groups are much more likely to be successful when their goals involve this kind of negative lobbying that seeks to block changes in policy. Most of the NRA's legislative victories in recent years fit this description. The NRA has successfully lobbied against a new ban on assault weapons, against reforms to the system of national background checks for handgun purchases, and against new limits on ownership of guns by mentally ill people. While the success of the NRA's negative lobbying attracts considerable attention, its failures in lobbying for policy change do not. Consider the NRA's advocacy of concealed carry laws. As noted earlier, there is little doubt that the NRA's leaders and most of its members favor the passage of such laws nationwide. But efforts to lobby Congress in favor of such laws are unlikely to be successful given public opposition and well-funded interest groups that are against concealed carry. These groups could respond with negative lobbying against any effort the NRA might make. As a result, while the NRA lobbies for concealed carry, it has failed to help enact national legislation, and the limits on its power over legislation do not get much publicity. Amount of public attention. Interest groups are more likely to succeed when their request attracts little public attention. When the average voter does not know or care about a group's request, legislators and bureaucrats do not have to worry about the political consequences of giving the group what it wants. The only question is whether the officials themselves favor the request or can be convinced that the group's desired change is worthwhile. In contrast, when the issue attracts a lot of public attention, legislators' respond to the lobbying will hinge on their judgment of constituent opinion. Do voters favor what the group wants? After all, the average legislator has a strong interest in re-election and is unlikely to act against his or her constituents' wishes. As a result, lobbying may count for nothing in the face of public opposition, or may be superfluous when the group's position already has public support. While the idea of interest group lobbying probably brings to mind titanic struggles on controversial issues such as gun control, abortion rights, or judicial nominations, low-profile issues are surprisingly common. Many groups are indeed active for or against these high-profile issues and try to capture public attention as a way of pressuring the government, but not all interest groups. Lobbying is so high profile. Remember the National Turkey Federation, the people who give the president a turkey every Thanksgiving in the winter of 2014. The Federation successfully lobbied federal bureaucrats to increase propane supplies to Midwest states facing record cold temperatures, including areas where the Federation's members use propane to heat their barns. The policy change resulting from the Federation's lobbying efforts attracted no publicity, which is precisely the point. When few people know or care about a policy change, interest groups are able to dominate the policy-making process. Level of conflict. Interest group influence is much less apparent on highly conflictual issues. Excuse me. Those over which public opinion is split in groups are active on all sides of the issue. Consider gun control. The ongoing debate over gun control attracts many well-funded interest groups and coalitions which support different versions of gun control or want no change to current policy. There is no consensus among members of Congress, interest groups, or the American public about which policy changes are needed. Under these conditions, access doesn't count for much. Legislators have a keen sense of political costs of accommodating a group's demands. As a result, stalemate is the likely result, which is exactly what has happened over the last few years. Gun control laws have not been strengthened, but other than an increase in concealed and carry laws, there have not been significant changes in either directions. After the 2017 mass shooting in Las Vegas, in which 58 people were killed and 546 injured, the NRA said it would favor additional regulation of bump stocks, which allow 90 rounds to be fired in 10 seconds. President Trump started the process of banning bump stocks through an executive order in March 2018. The final rule went into effect on March 26, 2019. If policy change occurs at all, it is likely to reflect a complex process of bargaining and compromise, with no groups getting exactly what they want, which is what generally happens with gun control. The case of gun control also illustrates the fact that a group is a large or well-funded does not mean government officials will always comply with its request. Although many people worry that well-funded interest groups will use their financial resources to dominate the policy-making process, even if the public opinion is against them, these fears are largely unfounded. The conditions that are ripe for well-funded interest groups to become involved in policy debate typically ensure that there will be well-funded groups on all sides of a question. Under these conditions, no group is likely to get everything at once, and no group's lobbying efforts are likely to be decisive. Some groups may not get anything. However, gun control is not a typical case. Most cases of interest group influence look a lot like the National Turkey Federation's request for more propane. A group asks for something, there is relatively little opposition, and Congress or the bureaucracy responds with appropriate policy changes. The situation might have been very different if another group had lobbied on the other side against the Turkey Federation. If so, satisfying one group would have required displeasing at least one other group. Faced with this no-win situation, bureaucrats or legislators would be less likely to give the group what it wanted. At a minimum, there would have had to measure the Turkey Federation arguments against those made by other groups. Unpacking the conflict. Considering all that we've discussed in this chapter, let's apply what we know about how interest groups work to the example of the tax credits discussed at the beginning of this chapter. It is fair to characterize all interest groups as self-interested organizations that undermine the public good. Are interest groups really too powerful manipulators of the American policy process. Many Americans think that interest groups are powerful manipulators of the American policy process and that they are able to get what they want, regardless of the impact on everyone else. Sometimes it seems like heads they win, tails we lose, while the chapter's opener's example of income limit repeals in the CARES Act would support this view. There are countless counterexamples of laws that have been passed over the objections of corporations, including environmental protections, worker safety laws, consumer product and food safety regulations, and minimum wages laws. So the truth is much more complex. Interest groups represent many different Americans, many of whom are unaware that lobbying occurs on their behalf. Moreover, for many groups, the challenge is to get organized in the first place or scrape together enough resources to start lobbying. These efforts don't always succeed because of the collective action problem. Interest groups are more likely to get what they want when their demands attract little public attention or no opposition from other groups. When a group asks for a large or controversial policy change, it stands little chance of success. Even if the group has many members, a large lobbying budget, or an influential leader directing its operation. The CARES Act also reflects this complexity. While lobbyists were able to sneak in the tax provisions that benefited their clients to the tune of $135 billion over 10 years, the bill also did a lot of good for millions of Americans who were in desperate need. Small businesses, hospitals, state and local governments, and researchers rushing to make a vaccine all received necessary aid. Most Americans received a $1,200 check just in time to help them make their next rent payment. And millions of people who lost their jobs benefited from the extension of unemployment compensation. So the special interests have their big chunk of the pie. But the American people received more of what they needed to try to get back on their feet. In sum, while individual lobbying efforts often reflect the efforts of small groups to achieve favored policy outcomes at the expense of the majority, when we look across the entire range of interest group activities, a different picture emerges. In the main, interest groups reflect the conflictual nature of American politics and the resulting drive of individuals, groups, and corporations to shape American public policy in line with their policy goals. The average citizen benefits as well as losses from the lobbying activities. This is the end of Chapter 9, Part 2.